Hello and welcome everyone to the James Alison webinar, How Did We Get Here? LGBTIQA Plus and the Church, which is presented by Garratt Publishing, Yarra Theological Union, University of Divinity, the Rainbow Catholics InterAgency for Ministry, Catholic Religious Australia, and the Australian Catholic Coalition for Reform. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge that I am hosting this webinar from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar Boodja. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and live today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples participating in this webinar. Now I'll start with an opening prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord God, our Maker, the work of your hands reveals boundless goodness and glory, from intricate snowflakes to majestic peaks and every sunrise. Your limitless love shapes our world and each of us. As we gaze upon your diverse children, may we always appreciate the dignity of each person, regardless of their identity, straight, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, asexual. Celebrate the unique artistry you've woven into each heart. Your love creates us all. Forgive our shortcomings, Lord, for failing to see others' beauty, for our apathy, and for our silence when we should have spoken. Your love forgives us all. We pray for unity, tenderness, justice, and compassion, that the world may know you through our love for one another. Your love heals us all. Amen. In the name of Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Now I'd like to welcome Father James Alison. He is a Catholic theologian, priest, and author. His principal claim to fame is as one of those who have done the great work to bring the great thinker, René Girard, to a wider public. In addition, he is known for his firm but patient insistence on truthfulness in matters gay as an ordinary part of basic Christianity, and for his pastoral outreach in the same sphere. Let's give it up for Father James Alison.
Well, good evening, and thank you very, very much indeed for honouring me by allowing me to speak to you. It's a thrill to be in Australia in the first place, and a delight to be taking part in this nationwide, widely spread discussion. And what I'm going to do is, over about half an hour, I'm going to give a little answer to the question that we were given at the beginning, which is like, how did we get here? LGBTIQA plus and the church, before we then have discussion and questions. So I'd like to divide what I'm going to say into three, what I hope will be 10-minute chunks, and I shall try and behave myself and keep to those 10-minute chunks. In the first one, a little bit of background history, because where we are now is not really comprehensible without a great deal of historical background, and historical context makes a huge difference, particularly as Catholics, as I hope will become clear. Ever since we have knowledge of humans, there have been the people who we would now call LGBTQI and A. And of course, they have lived in every culture that we have evidence of across the face of the earth. But they haven't always, or we haven't always been thought of in anything like the same way as we are today. And in fact, the discovery of what we refer to as homosexuality, or people who are oriented towards people of the same sex, is a relatively recent discovery, as I hope I will make clear, and it was reached through quite particular means. The key moment in this, I'm going to suggest, is the early modern period, around the 17th century in Northern Europe, when what historians began to notice as companionate marriage starts up. Companionate marriage is when people start getting married because they like each other. You might think, oh, that seems very natural to us. Well, curiously, at the time, it was considered somewhat remarkable. People noticed, for instance, that St. Thomas More was in love with his wife and vice versa. And they commented on it because it was wonderful, but also because it was rare. Marriages at the time, as in many more traditional societies, tended to be organized at fairly young ages on the basis of kinship protection, property protection, tribe protection, a whole variety of factors, of which the emotional and erotic inclinations of the spouses was not high on the register of important matters. But from the 17th century, this starts to become normal. Why is this important? Well, because it marks the gradual dissipation of something which had been dissipating in the later Middle Ages or across Europe, which was what we would now expect to see in an Islamic society. What the sociologists have referred to as a homosocial society where, after a fairly short time of being brought up together when they're tiny little babies, boys and girls are separated out, and the women get brought up amongst the girls get brought up amongst the women, and the boys get brought up amongst the men. Relations between them are carefully invigilated and chaperoned. Marriages, as I mentioned, are arranged. And in the homosocial world, there exists what one might call a great don't ask, don't tell with relation to what people get up to outside what is officially expected of them. And this happens on the women's side and on the men's side. Great don't ask, don't tell, provided that you achieve what you're supposed to do, get married, have kids, get involved in protecting and maintaining the family's lines, business, and so on and so forth. That's fine. What happens off the stage, don't ask, don't tell. And that's very much how people who have been in modern societies, which are still like that, modern homosocial, have described them until recently, when, of course, fundamentalism has reached the Islamic world in as much the same way as it's reached the Christian world, and people have started actively persecuting rather than playing the don't ask, don't tell route. Now, from the 17th century onwards, as people started to become visible, well, no, that's a mistaken way of putting it. As the society became more of what we would call heterosocial, in other words, boys and girls started going out with each other because they liked each other and wanted to be each other's best friend and get married. And so you got the beginnings of a heterosocial society, and with it, changing patterns of dating and so forth. A group of people who had previously been invisible started to become visible. And guess what? That's the people who we would now call gay or lesbian. Why? Because they didn't fit into the new rules of the game. And it's from that time onwards that historians begin to notice certain pubs, cruising grounds, where such people begin to hang out and socialize. And of course, initially they're treated as very threatening people. Who are these weird people who are not quite like us? Maybe they're traitors, maybe they're emissaries of the papists, because at least in the case of the English-speaking world, the association with sodomy and papistry had been deliberately fomented since the time of King Henry's dissolution of the monasteries. He needed a good excuse to get rid of the monasteries rather than merely enriching himself from them. So accusing them of being hotbeds of sodomy seemed a good way to go. But it meant that the people who were being discovered by a mixture of what we would now call police, the king's men, and a mixture of blackmailers, starting to become visible as these, what is this about? As these strange people, half insiders, half outsiders, who therefore were very often subject to a great deal of cruelty. And it's over the next 3 or 4 centuries that gradually the attempt to control these weirdos shifts. First, from being treasonous, sinning, treacherous, sodomitical, papistical, other to being a medical other in the 18th century, then a mentally deranged other towards the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. Then with the beginnings of psychology, the realization that actually it's not just so much the acts that are odd, but that there are some sort of people who just are this way. And that is, and incidentally, because they just are this way, why get so worked up about the acts? Because the acts seem to have no real criminal or papistical or heretical consequences. And that, towards the end of the 19th century, is when we get the word homosexual. It's invented by an Austro-German, Austro-Hungarian thinker who's trying to protest against the sodomy laws. And it's saying for the first time, this is just a certain sort of people. This is how they are. There may be something wrong with them, as indeed people at the time thought there was. But they don't seem to be particularly dangerous. Why should we make such a fuss about making their life criminal? The first generations of psychologists following Freud tended to think that there was something intrinsically wrong with the orientation towards people of the same sex. Freud himself initially thought that paranoia was at the root of the homosexual orientation. It wasn't until after the First World War, really, that there became a sufficient critical mass of people who had probably met up with each other during the mass mobilizations of the First World War, men in the army, women in the armaments factories, that people who, when the war was over, were able, rather than returning to their villages of origin, to stay in bigger places where there was more chance for them to socialize, find partners, have sex, etc. So it was then that scientists began to start looking at these people saying, these people don't seem to have anything in particular wrong with them. They just are this way. So the first, what we would now call sexological studies, happen around that time, and then receive the mighty blow of the Nazis coming to power in Germany, where many of these studies began, and the books all burnt because the Nazis needed to distance themselves from matters gay, because some of their key leaders were particularly well known to be gay men at the time. And Sloman, the head of the SA, had to be killed, and his clerk of pretty boys killed with him, precisely to separate Nazism from any link that it might be somehow a sodomitical enterprise. So it wasn't until after the Second World War, when yet again the fruit of a mass demobilization, sufficient critical mass of people is found whom students and scientists can look at and just say, okay, these people are not presenting themselves as problems, they're just living life as normal. What makes them tick? And that's the interesting question. That's the question which I think comes clear in the 1950s of the last century, when for the first time, rather than these people are a problem, how do we sort them out? It starts to become, this is interesting, what makes these people tick? The scientific question replaces the scapegoating question. And from the 1950s onwards, it becomes clear that there is no pathology intrinsic to the homosexual inclination. Same-sex inclination is not automatically a sign of some pathology. The tests were done to try and see if people could work out whether someone was gay or straight, depending on what pathologies they had. And it was discovered, what I suspect is obvious to us, but was quite new at the time, which is that we're all as screwed up as each other. Gay people are neither more nor less screwed up than straight people, and straight people are neither more nor less screwed up than gay people. There are differences according to minority stress, because of course minorities are always going to be stressed living in a majority that's not like them, but that's not particular to gay and lesbian people. That's true of just about any minority in any majority society. And that's been pretty clear from the 1950s onwards. It was clear in the US, it was clear in the UK. When the Wolfenden Commission, set up by the House of Lords, said as much in 1957, which was the beginning of the process of decriminalisation in the United Kingdom. And various psychological associations took their sweet time to get behind this, but the evidence was there from the late 1950s. This is not There is no pathology that is intrinsic to people who are gay or lesbian. Now, that's a much bigger piece of anthropological learning than we usually credit for. And I want to leave us just at that point with this first little chunk. I've tried to bring us through the space of the undoing of the scapegoat mechanism with regards to these weirdos to the place where we can simply say, okay, this is just something that is. These people are not bearers of any particular disorder. They are the bearers of a non-pathological minority variant in the human condition, something rather like left-handedness, which is a non-pathological minority variant in the human condition, but one which in times past used to be thought of as something of a defect, a defect in a supposedly intrinsically right-handed human. Okay, now let's look at the parallel history of church teaching in this area. The Catholic Church only basically has had one teaching in matters sexual from the 2nd century onwards, and it is this, that the sexual act, when it is between a husband and a wife and intends procreation, or at least is open to procreation, is a good thing. Everything else is a bad thing. This was first coined as the, if you like, the very rigorous Christian approach to sex in the 2nd century by Clement of Alexandria, and in part it was a rejection of the pagan cults, the fertility cults, orgies, and so forth. But in part it was, we must find something that corresponds to what the Creator wants of us. And since the Creator has shown us that children are to be produced sexually, that human reproduction is sexual, that must be a good thing. But anything that isn't that is a bad thing. Now, as you can imagine, that depended a huge amount on the biology of the time. The biology of the time assumed that women were purely passive seedbeds within which males planted sperm seeds that were homunculi, and the homunculi grew up. And when they came to birth, if the wind blew in a certain direction and the humidity was such and such, perfect humans were born, i.e. males. And if the wind was in another direction and a different sort of humidity, imperfect humans were born, i.e. females, just to give you an idea that that's what the best biology of that time was in this matter. And that biology lasted throughout the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, for instance, St. Albert the Great taught that to St. Thomas Aquinas, and that's the basis of the understanding of biology with which we've been working, at least with which Catholic ethics has been working since. Now, of course, things changed as more and more got known about the female contribution to the reproductive system, but that's very recent. The ovary was discovered in 1858. The something of the workings of the menstrual cycle was discovered in 1870. In other words, the notion that our biology is somewhat different to what all our morality had taught us is very recent. And this had reached a key point by 1968, when in the latter part of the 19th century, in the early 20th century, it became clear that sexual relationships between married couples for the purpose of giving each other comfort and pleasure was a good thing, and that pleasure was not entirely a negative thing, as had been taught very specifically in the 2nd century. It was assumed that pleasure was a demonic intervention into the procreative act, and that the best sex should be done for babies and without pleasure. But that began to shift by the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And then, of course, as more and more reliable methods of contraception became available, people began to ask, well, is it actually necessary to be intending to have a baby, or at least to being open to the possibility of having a baby every time one has sex? And more people said, no, it's perfectly clear that as part of marriage, you can have recreational sex separate from procreative sex. And this led to a huge crisis in the teaching of the church, as you probably know, in 1968, when Paul VI, who'd appointed a commission to look into the matter, the majority of the commission said, yes, we can break the distinction between the unitive and the procreative function of sex. And a minority of the commission, headed by the then Cardinal of Krakow, Karol Wojtyla, who said, no, in no way can this ever be separated. And Paul VI sided with the minority commission, not least because he was tipped off by a French Jesuit called Gustave Martelet, who pointed out to him that if you separate the unitive from the procreative function of sex, if you separate the love-making from the baby-making function of sex, then the church has no logical reason to teach against homosexuality. And logically, he was absolutely right. That is, if you like, the key breaking point in this whole discussion in terms of teaching. As you know, the vast majority of Catholic straight people think that they can separate the unitive from the procreative function of sexual acts, and that not every marital act needs to be open to procreation. The church's attempt to insist on the second century teaching failed badly, and it caused a huge crisis for Paul VI. Wojtyla then became Pope John Paul and tried very hard to find ways of justifying the teaching with his theology of the body, again trying to dress up, if you like, the ancient teaching in more modern sounding clothes, but it hasn't really convinced anybody. The relationship between lovemaking and baby-making in straight people is statistical, not inherent. It's to do with time of month, quality of sperm, eggs, implantation, a whole variety of factors. But it's not, as had been assumed, that there was an inherent link between the sex act and babies. Okay. We are in the situation, obviously, whereby the moment it becomes clear that it's perfectly possible to have sexual acts which are just for the purpose of lovemaking rather than for baby-making, that same-sex acts start to become possibly good. But as you know, the attempts over the last 25 or 30 years have been to try and stick us even more firmly with the second century teaching. So first of all, a reminder that the acts are intrinsically evil, but that doesn't mean, the word intrinsically doesn't mean especially evil. It merely means that however often you do them, they will never achieve their finality, which is to have a baby. In other words, it's just saying the same-sex act of itself will never produce babies. This is not exactly information. Well, if it is information, then you perhaps need to learn it. But that's the point of it. It's saying it's a bad act because it isn't directed towards making babies. But they then had to say something rather more terrible, because it began to become clear after the 1950s and into the 1960s and 70s that being gay or lesbian is not some sort of pathology or vice, as had been previously thought, but simply something that is, as I mentioned, a non-pathological minority variant in the human condition. And if it's a non-pathological minority variant in the human condition, then of course the tendency itself might lead to act that might be good, might enable one to distinguish between, let us say, gang rape and lovemaking. But the church teaching didn't want to allow that. So it had to come up with a way of describing people as objectively disordered. That's the term that they used, meaning you can't trust and believe any of this stuff about the condition itself being neutral or positive. No, the very fact that you want to have sex with someone who is of the same sex means that your pattern of desire is ordered away from its object, its true object, which would be someone of the opposite sex with whom we might have a baby. And of course, what that means is that us gay and lesbian people are people who, according to their official teaching, are, as it were, bodies that of themselves want to have heterosexual sex to have babies, but our patterns of desire somehow are pushing against our bodies, fighting against our bodies, and therefore are disordered with relation to their object. And I hope you can see that from that point on, the church is in deep trouble with relation to attempting to make this stick, because as more and more of us discover that actually being gay or lesbian is simply something that is, and start in good conscience to say, well, if I am this way, then of course I must learn how to be this the best way possible. And Church of says, no, we can't let you do that. You need to think of yourself as someone who is intrinsically heterosexual, but suffers from a grave distortion of desire called same-sex orientation. And of course, that was the background teaching to some of the conversion therapy artists like Nicolosi and others who formed or tried to push conversion therapy, that precisely it followed the deductive pattern of saying who you are as gay and lesbian people must be deduced from something that you are neither doing nor trying to do. In other words, have sex with someone of the opposite sex in order to have a baby. And the moment you oblige people to try and deduce who they are from something that they are not, you're in deep trouble. And that, of course, is where the teaching of the church has reached its current position of incredibility. And I think that that's one of the things, thank heavens, that Francis wants to help move on in the synodal discussion. Okay, to get to the third part. The doctrinal issue is not that complicated. In other words, once we know what we know about biology, once we know what we know about sexual orientation, there's no particular reason why the obvious Catholic teaching shouldn't just become clear. And the obvious Catholic teaching would be, well, grace perfects nature, so you gay, you lesbian people must work out now, starting from the most ordinary and basic of Christian principles to do with mercy and patience and so forth, how to become the best people that you can be, humanize your sexual desires, form relationships that are peaceful, charitable, enable you to give yourselves away to others, just like anybody else. Some of you will want to be celibate, some of you will want to be partnered. We're going to have to work this out from first principles, because there's no source of authority on this. The only sources of authority were a second century teaching about the marital act and certain biblical passages which modern Catholic theology does not regard as applying to homosexuality. Why then is the matter difficult? Well, it's difficult because, if you like, the don't ask, don't tell rule that I described as belonging to purely homosocial societies still applies to the clerical world, very painfully and uncomfortably. But that means that that which theologically is not very complicated is psychologically extremely complicated for the clerical world. Let's think about it this way. If you were what we would now call a gay man in the coming of age at the very beginning of the 20th century, around you, you would have noticed just the beginnings of writing biographically, telling stories in which gay and lesbian people starting to become apparent. In other words, narrative, people talking about these things was starting to become possible. The shrinks were beginning to make talking about things possible. But what you would have noticed round about you is a world in which there was a great deal of blackmail, a huge amount of syphilis, murder, rejection, loss of reputation. This was not a safe space. And the safest space for you to be at the time was the church. If you were a boy, because no one would ask you for a girlfriend in the clergy. If you were a girl, because no one would ask you for a boyfriend in the nunnery. The history of this in the 20th century is the gradual, how would you say this, changing of the dynamic. As decriminalization happened, as the realization that being gay was simply something that happened, the civil society gradually got more and more bearable a place. You could get a job, you could keep a job, you could keep your reputation. But the don't ask, don't tell of the clerical world, which had been a comparatively benign form of hypocrisy at the time, started to become an ever more drastic form of hypocrisy, because it forces people not to be able to ask and not to be able to tell, when now it's real possibility for them to be able to ask and tell. And so you start to get a number of church leaders who are, let us say this quite clearly, severely disturbed people who live with great cognitive dissonance. I mean, what you and I would call grand old closet queens, in charge of our church. And we've had no shortage of such examples. If you read Martel's book on the Vatican, you can tell how those most strongly opposed to any teaching in this area were themselves gay to a man, with strong double lives in most cases. And that has made the discussion incredibly difficult. The whole issue surrounding the necessity in clerical formation for people not to tell the truth about themselves has meant that church has tried to keep a don't ask, don't tell structure, which is falling apart before our eyes because of all the things associated with child abuse. The need to have honest people being transparent at every stage of their formation starts to become clear. But given that the clergy is a majority gay employment group, people becoming honest in this sphere causes the whole system to shake, because of course you can only become honest if you can agree that it isn't actually a disorder. They may ask you to be celibate, but they can't ask you not to be gay. And that is part of the problem that we're at now. I think that enough people, particularly clergy of the younger middle age, have become aware of the intolerability of this for the whole issue to be up in the air. And I think that Pope Francis knows that one of the key things to undo clericalism is being able to undo the necessity for lies and rigidity surrounding this whole issue. And I strongly pray that he and those whom he has chosen to go to the synod, which include, I should say, a number of people whom I know personally to be very LGBT friendly and very keen on helping us all move on in this issue, what he is helping to do by getting the discussion going in such a way that the old guard needn't be shamed and needn't go into schism. Well, I don't know how I've done on the timing of that. Have I done about 30 minutes? I think so. I've done 29 minutes. I think I've got the three points: a little bit of historical background, a little history of doctrine, and some sense of why this is such a difficult issue within at least the hierarchical structure of the church. There's, of course, much more for us to do, because most of you, I suspect, are involved in things like education and things like that, where obviously the need for kids to grow up safe and truthful and honest and not being cowed into deference to some sort of system that does their souls harm is of first importance. So may I throw it open? What would you like to talk about?
Hey everyone, yes, so as James mentioned, we're going into Q&A now. So we're going to open up the floor, and how you submit your questions is at the bottom of Zoom. Next, there's a button that says Q&A, which is with two discussion speech bubbles. So what you do is you click on that, and then you enter your question there. And this section will be led by Natalie Lindner and Noah Reisman, who are both from ACU, Australian Catholic University. So Noah Reisman is a cisgender gay man who is the creator and co-leader of ACU's Ally Network. And he also serves as the history professor specializing in sexuality and gender. And Natalie, also a lecturer there, specializes in ecumenics and ecclesiology, researching ecclesial acts of repentance in Australia. She's also a feminist, LGBT ally, and was part of ACU's Ally Network and the Australian Catholic Theological Association's Justice Network.
James, thanks so much for your talk. And as a historian, I found it especially exciting to hear the historical background. The questions are slowly filling in, but I might just ask one just to get things started as people take time to throw them in there. So look, I'm not Catholic, but I work for ACU, obviously. So this might be a bit of a provocative question coming from a non-Catholic. But as an observer of the church and its position on LGBTIQA plus rights, or at least the spoken position, but we also look at secular society in places like Australia, which have become much more progressive, much more accepting, much more inclusive. There definitely seems to be a lot more lurch to the right in the church as more and more people leave the church. And I guess the provocative question is, why should LGBTIQA plus Catholics and their allies stay in the church as it drifts more to the right, but society drifts more to the left?
Well, all I can answer that is my own point of view. It seems to me that if the Catholic faith is true in the sense of Jesus having come into the world to do what he did and teaching us what he is to do, then it's worth sticking around and fighting for what is true, even in the midst of it. Obviously, as you can imagine, I have known many people who have left the church for this sort of reason, and many have just given up on religion altogether. Many have joined more LGBT-friendly churches. My own view is that it's better to be a small fish in the ocean than a big fish in an aquarium, and that the Catholic Church at its best is not particularly churchy. It's a huge number of people with comparatively few church leaders. And most of what it is about is reaching out to other human beings. And actually, I suspect you also know this, that at the same time as Catholic leadership has gone somewhat backwards until Pope Francis came along and started kicking them into the 21st century, the actual, at least the Pew Foundation figures suggest that Catholic lay people are particularly likely to be gay friendly. In other words, Catholic lay people very quickly pick up that if someone just is that way, well, then of course they should be themselves to the very best of their possibilities. In other words, curiously, they pick up what is genuine Catholic teaching much faster than the people who want them locked in some sort of second century structure that is well past its sell-by date. And that for me is particularly as I live in Catholic majority countries, where I see, as you see as well, the hopelessness of much of the clerical structure. But nevertheless, the refusal to be quite so stupid as that by a huge number of Catholic people.
Thanks for that question, Noah, and for your response there, James. James, I found that the naming of the cognitive dissonance that continues, I think perhaps even to function something like a structure within church cultures. I wonder, as we see increasingly run-of-the-mill, everyday Catholics in the pews, or perhaps on the edge of the pews, perhaps occupying the pews every so often, there is, and certainly in the consultation around the plenary council here in Australia, and again in the synod papers that we've seen come forward, that movement towards a growing desire to be inclusive in our practice as communities. Yep. So how do we name and own that cognitive dissonance in a way that is not going to continue to do harm? Because ultimately, I find it very hard and worry terribly about how it is that reform is ultimately going to take place. How much integrity does our inclusion really have if we still have within us these official lines with very unfriendly language like intrinsically evil, intrinsically disordered? This cognitive dissonance doesn't just do harm to others that we might continue to other out there, it does harm to all of us who participate in those cultures in which this structure continues to take form and to form us.
Yes, no, I agree. I agree entirely. And like you, I long for the language officially to be changed. Now, as you're aware, every single church that has faced this issue has gone into schism about it up till now. And I think that Francis knows that his principal job as a centre of unity is to avoid that. So from his perspective, and I'm basically, simply applying what he said about other issues to this sphere here, which I think is reasonable, the horizontal movement of making discussion possible is the way in which reality can impose itself upon ideas. Remember that we tend to still think of the church as with a pyramidal model. In other words, someone at the top who has the right ideas, and they tell us and we're supposed to obey. Now that's a bad piece of like understanding of how reason works in the first place. But it's a particularly bad piece of learning about how human relationships work. It's actually through changes in our relationships that we change our thinking. Relationality is prior to rationality. I think that it's that he's trying to change. The more we get to know other people like ourselves, and we say, oh my God, gay people aren't objectively disordered, it's nonsense. And then if someone tries to insist that they are, we say, what's wrong with you? Why do you need this one so much? With the point of trying hard not to shame them. But very often you will see that there are complicated reasons why somebody needs to insist on that. And I think that's part of the difficulty, how not to shame people who've locked themselves into a sacred closet, but how continuously just to speak up for the fact that we know what reality is in this sphere. We are learning this when our children come out, when our neighbors come out, when our relatives come out, when we come out. It becomes possible to judge whether or not we're crazier or more screwed up than anybody else.
So with one eye to noticing our capacity to shame one another and being careful to guard against that, we can lean into the solidarity of inclusion, and we can let that relationality inform our practice.
Yes, and curiously, I think that, in one sense, remember that the teaching on homosexuality is very recent. The word homosexuality first appeared in a church document in 1975. The public, it may have appeared in private documents in the past, but in a public teaching document first appeared in 1975. And that was the intrinsically evil acts, but not yet the objective disorder. They came up with the objective disorder in 1986. Why? Because they realized that if people just are a certain way, then their acts are going to be good or bad according to circumstances, like everybody else's. Because you can't claim that somebody is, that this is a non-pathological minority variant, and yet say that the person must not have sex because they would be failing to be straight. But they're not straight. So it's a nonsense. So it's 1986 was a desperate attempt, if you like, to circle the wagon, to close the argument. And it failed. We now, those who are stuck with it are stuck with saying, well, you aren't really gay or lesbian people. We know better than you who you are. And we know it not from God, but from a deduction from an a prioristic argument from the 2nd century before Christ. You say, okay, you seem to be very much in the same sphere as those people who thought that Galileo must be wrong because of the book of Genesis. It's the same problem. But at this stage, I think the deference is a problem. I think that straightforwardness, ordinariness, and saying, okay, we understand why you're sticking with that, maybe for personal and professional reasons, but do not cause us to do harm to the kids. I've just been listening to a very well-made podcast called Dear Alana, which is a podcast concerning a North American young lady who killed herself. And it seems to be that suicide was provoked by some sort of conversion therapy being forced on her by the diocese in which she was very pious. And it's a terrible story, very well told. But we can't carry on doing harm to young people in this way. Absolutely not. I think that we have to stand up and say, no, this is just not true. We're talking about people who are bearers of a non-pathological minority variant in the human condition. E basta. Sorry to. And I think incidentally that the younger generations, it is more and more obvious to everybody. So the whole question is basically allowing the fact that a socialized discourse in this sphere is increasingly common to reach people for whom it is difficult in a way that doesn't shame them. And that is quite an art. But I think lots and lots of priests are longing to be able to break out of the kind of the omerta of the clerical world in this sphere. Longing to. Particularly remember that so many of them have been accused tangentially of being abusers simply by the fact that they are gay. The assumption pushed by church leaders for a number of decades until relatively recently was that child abuse was some sort of a sign of being homosexual. I'm not making this up.
No.
It really took scientific work in the first decade of 2000, between 2000 and 2010, for the church finally to be told, and this credits to Joseph Ratzinger. He brought together the scientists in the Vatican, asked them, tell us about this. Is there an intrinsic link between homosexuality and pedophilia? And they said, no, there is no intrinsic link between homosexuality and pedophilia. So that now even the Secretary of State, current Secretary of State, says quite publicly in a preface to the book, there is no intrinsic link between. That's taken a long time. But just think how many priests have been humiliated by the assumption that because they're gay, they're potential abusers. It's awful. I think many want to come out and speak more clearly.
So, James, we've got a long list of over 20 questions now, so I might start diving into some of them. I'm going to try and hybridize 3 of them now, which have been sitting here for a while. So there are a few questions that are a bit about church teaching and also about scripture and scholarship on scripture. So I'm sort of going to merge these into 2 questions. One of them is can you tell us a bit about what the modern scripture scholarship is in relation to passages about homosexuality, and also where that sits against the other teachings, the very principles of Jesus's teaching, such as acceptance of love for all of God's creation. And this is a second question, but I'm just throwing it all in there now. Where does the teaching on conscience apply, particularly the views of John Henry Newman?
Excellent. Good. Well, so here's a key point about the first question. Remember that from the Catholic point of view, the texts, which I refer to as the clobber texts, the 7 famous texts which are used to hit gay people over the head, were never the source of the teaching. If you like, they were the drag with which it was clothed, the rhetorical noise with which it was clothed for preaching purposes. But the actual teaching was what I have described to you about the wrongness of anything that was not open to marriage. That was the basis of church teaching. So preaching against the sin of Sodom, for instance, was a way of making a great deal of noise. Now, no one, I don't think, even the more conservative Protestant theologians, but certainly not any of the mainline Catholic theologians, regard the text of Sodom as being anything to do with homosexuality. It isn't. All you need to do is to have a reasonably correct translation. You can see for yourself that it's not. That's been pretty clear since the 1950s. I could go through each one of the other texts to show the same thing. There is no reference to what we call homosexuality in the sacred scriptures. I could give a day on that, and it's great fun because it opens one up to how the Bible works. But the good thing is, in the Catholic setup, is that the Pontifical Biblical Commission is absolutely on board with this. It says, yeah, no, it is absolutely wrong to bring up to date ancient texts referring to ancient realities in such a way as to have effects against charity on modern people. That's standard Catholic biblical teaching from the Pontifical Biblical Commission. Very good document signed in 1983 by then Cardinal Ratzinger, and a more recent book on Christian anthropology called something like "What is Man?" Che cosa l'uomo? What is mankind? Which it says the same. So I think we can say that the history of the use of scriptural texts that have nothing to do with homosexuality as opportunistic weapons against gay people, at least in official Catholic circles, I hope has now come to an end. And then secondly, the point you make about conscience, yes, this is where we are essentially. I gave you an argument which suggests that what we're finding increasingly amongst gay and lesbian people who simply come out as who they are, it's an act of conscience. It's saying, okay, I'm discovering myself to be this thing. How do I fit in? What does that mean? How do I become who I am to become? And more people, thank heavens, are not accepting the fact that they're defective straight people, which is the direct implication of the current teaching. and therefore they're rejecting it. And I think that they're right to reject it. I think the interesting point is that if you like, certain more conservative people would like to say, well, okay, let's keep the norm and you can all be exceptions to it. So yes, as long as we pretend that the teaching stays the same and that these acts are intrinsically evil, because they're your inclination, of course, we can say that there is no fault in them at all. If you like, it's trying to save the norm at the expense of the people saying, okay, you can be free just as long as you don't pretend that the norm must change. But no, this is nonsense. It appears that we're not talking about individuals who've discovered something that is individually true about them, but a variety of people who've discovered something that is sociologically true about them as a class of people. In other words, once you have that, then it's perfectly clear the teaching yields to conscience. It can't be taught because it's not true. So I'm afraid I think that's where we are at the moment. But the notion that, remember that the point of conscience is, at its root, it's consciousness of being a son or a daughter of God. And there comes a point where you have to say, am I this thing? And if I am I a defective straight person? And if I'm not, well then, I must get on and learn how to love and give myself away in love as best I can. And furthermore, that in doing so, I'm not actually breaking any church teaching. Church teaching obviously doesn't apply because it's not true. And I think that that's the stage where we're reaching at the moment, with a huge number, an increasing number of people for very good reasons.
James, we have a number of questions coming in around particular identities within LGBTIQ plus, where there's some questions to do with where does bisexuality fit into the frame? How do you speak to the treatment of and the increasing marginalisation of trans people within the movement? Particularly, there was a reference to some of the feminist, the angry. Well, I have to be careful about my words here. About some of the anti-trans sentiment that can be around the conversations. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I mean, again, it seems to me that what is important in what I hope I showed with history is that history is a process, in this case, is a process of discovery of people who were at first assumed to be something defective, and later we learnt a lot more about who they actually were. And that this is, in some senses, a very slow process, but at the moment it appears to be speeding up because we're aware that this is a learning process. We now know much more about bisexuality than we learned before people started to be able to express themselves clearly. There was a time when people said they were bisexual because they were frightened of saying they were queer. Now there are some people who are the reverse, fear saying they're bisexual because people will think that they're being frightened of who they are. Whereas, in fact, it's perfectly clear that there are some people who genuinely are bisexual and that this is an equivalent orientation. Therefore, the question will be with whom they relate. The pattern of their life is going to be with whom they relate. But certainly the notion that it might be someone of either sex is going to be something pacifically accepted. And of course, it's the same with the reality of trans. I mean, when I was a kid, there was a very distinguished trans woman in the United Kingdom called, I'm going to get her name wrong. She was called, no, suddenly I've forgotten. She was a friend of my aunt, actually. She was a friend of my aunt even as a man before she became a woman, but enormously respected public figure who'd written a biography, had had a distinguished military career, had been something of a James Bond spy type figure after the Second World War, and became a woman. So that the reality has always been present, what it has, and has not been a vilified one. What we are now seeing is, of course, people becoming aware of who they are much younger, expressing themselves with much greater clarity, showing distress over time in such a way as to make people think these people have a real claim on being taken seriously as suggesting that they are other than what the gender assigned at birth is telling us about them. So for me, this is part of being on a learning process. This was, as recently as 15 years ago, I knew very, very little about this. And since then, I've had the honor and privilege of meeting and talking to and listening to many trans men and women who have shared how things have happened. Some of them have been very dramatic. Others have been immensely peaceful and serene. So,
and I love the emphasis you're offering there in terms of allowing ourselves the generosity of being able to learn. You know, it's okay to have spaces in which the can unfold, and appropriate spaces for that. I think not all spaces are appropriate for that, but it's important that we
it's very important.
Provide ourselves with permission to be curious and to allow our learning to develop.
Well, within the Catholic setup, there is, unfortunately, there's one of the tendencies that our authorities do have is that what I call the legislative urge. Once a new field comes out, they very quickly rush to their first principles and come up with legislative things that are designed for schools or wherever, or hospitals or whatever. And these are very rarely helpful the first time around. And there was a Vatican document on this subject 2 or 3 years ago, actually just shortly before COVID, male and female, he created them, which contained a number of grotesque mischaracterizations of the subject matter, and really didn't help at all. But of course, for those who want to batten down the hatches into a binary world, well, they use it. So yeah, it's not a question of I think us just being generous to ourselves. It's us actually insisting for the benefit of others on stretching out long enough for learning to be possible, rather than reach for the legislative urge. And I'm sure you have in Australia, certainly in the UK, there are a number of very fine teachers, including openly trans RE teachers within Catholic school system, who have a very fine record of public speaking and are much appreciated by church authorities, which means that church authorities can be quite wise when they're not busy, trying to score brownie points or maybe get themselves a red hat or something like that. There are ways of taking time, making sure that the people involved are listened to appropriately.
That actually links well to the next two questions I'm going to try to combine, but also I think Jan Morris might have been the trans woman in
Jan Morris, who was
okay.
James Morris, Morris.
I don't usually dead name people, but Jan Morris was certainly her affirmed name.
Yes.
I'm finding two other questions that link to what you just finished up there, and they're about the sort of split between the church hierarchy and the structures versus what we might say going on the ground. So one of these questions is about, given this increasing divide, do you see any reconciliation happening between that divide? And I guess the other question that is also linked to that is, given the don't ask, don't tell legacy you've talked about, the complexity Pope Francis has to turn the tide, how important is it for lay Catholic LGBTIQ plus movement to this change, to provide ground root support, to find a way to get senior leaders to actually say something, do something, change something?
Yes. Well, my first instinct with this is, don't give the bastards too much free headspace. Really, if one thing we're learning through this synodal process, it is that there is a crisis of belonging at every level, in terms not just of church, but at every level of civil society, how we belong to things, how we communicate things, with the notion we have enormously more choice concerning the various forms of communication we get caught up in, who we listen to, how we listen to them, when we listen to them, which means that intentional Christianity is going to be intentional or not at all. So for me, the first thing is not to worry too much about what a particular hierarchical structure is thinking, to be aware that the real question, a really interesting question is, okay, what's it going to mean for us, small scale, to be Christian? What does it look like for us to be church going forward? So I think that the really important thing is don't let the obstacle get in the way of the project, if you like, of Christianity, because that's by being stuck in resentment against people who are being slow at catching up. Basically, we're giving them too much free rental space in our head. So I think that that's the first thing. On the other hand, I do want to say that as far as I can see, things are moving far faster than I had ever expected at this point. I've been belly aching on about this for 30 years odd, and the speed with which change has started just in the last 10 years, or even the last 15 years, even under Ratzinger, things were beginning to shift. Just because he wasn't as good at totalitarian as John Paul was. And he wasn't as totalitarian as John Paul. But with Francis, just the little nudges that he's given to make these things talkable about, I don't think that's a genie that can be put back in the lamp, or toothpaste that can be put back in the tube. I think that just because people have started to talk about this, it's become perfectly clear that people can disagree publicly about the teaching of the church. The fact that you've had the Cardinal Archbishop of Luxembourg, number 2 in the structure of organising the synod, has made it perfectly clear in public that he thinks the teaching must be changed, that it's unacceptable, that we have a teaching dating from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, which bears no relation to our understanding of biology, sexual orientation, etc. Now, if a cardinal can say that and not be sacked for it instantly, then we're in a different ballgame from what we were under John Paul. Secondly, just such ordinary things as recently, and this was just within the last 10 days, the Archbishop of Milan, one of the, prime historical sees in Europe, but certainly the most important diocese outside Rome in Italy, the largest diocese in Italy, gave as guidance for young people that there should be no difference in the treatment of same-sex young people, same-sex couples and other sex couples when it came to attempting to help people learn how to form relationships and friendships. You think, whoa! You can imagine the haters jumped on that. So you have the major diocese of Milan without any fanfare, simply saying that the socialization process of young people must be looked after independently of their, or irrespectively rather, of their sexual orientation. Okay, I wasn't expecting that one. In other words, these things, once people get the bit between their teeth, remember that an awful lot of clergy are gay and really don't want to be pushing this anti-gay stuff any longer. And only a relatively small number of them are pathological dwellers in cognitive dissonance, particularly as we get younger. So no, I'm rather hopeful with relation to this. I hope I've begun to answer the questions.
My turn to ask a question? Okay, so there's a question that's come through here from a person who has a role in a Catholic institution that works with people who are of all different faith identities or not, and has a question about our pastoral care, our pastoral response to people in our care. Now, this is a common occurrence for us here in Australia. We have many public institutions that are also Catholic institutions. So this person asks, as a trustee for a PJP educating some 10,000 young women, some of whom are going through gender realignment, what could be the messages of hope for their future and support and confidence that they can be provided that will support them?
Yeah. Well, I should imagine that there are significant issues to do simply with what the state of play of public law and public medicine is with relation to these things. But I think the notion that whoever is behind that particular group saying, we are not going to abandon you in the midst of these. We're going to help you negotiate the fact that you are becoming aware of who you are in this particular social situation with these particular laws regarding when you may change, when you may not change, with the current understanding of health. We're going to help you negotiate that because we are determined as Catholics that you should discover your flourishing, that being the central Catholic thing. And I think if necessary, if there's an attempt by a church authority to say, oh, it's all gender ideology, there is no such thing as trans people, which of course they have said, to simply say, we are not going to pay attention to enforced binary thinking from church authorities because it does not seem to be based on anything truthful. But, I get the impression that actually a considerable number of even quite conservative hierarchs were quite shocked with the document that came out, attempting to say that it was all gender ideology. Because it's too obvious for anybody who has a toe in the water that it's much more to do with reality than that. If you like, if anything is gender ideology, it's the refusal to consider that reality could be anything other than what a certain deduction from the book of Genesis says it is. So my sense is that actually there are very many good-hearted people on the ground who are doing exactly what the questioner was describing. And the question is the priority of flourishing. What is the maximal form of this person's flourishing? And how can we, anybody who's in the church, help them? And how can we welcome their testimony as to what flourishing looks like for them, so that they are not only the object of concern, but the subject of wisdom? It seems to me to be very important.
As a person who does research on trans history, can I just say the expression gender ideology is something that was invented by anti-trans folk. It's not a real thing. And anytime you see that floated around, it's anti-trans. I'm going to throw together 3 questions, which might take us to the end of the Q&A, especially because some of them look a bit provocative about the present and the future. One of them is, James, what's your sense of how the Synod will deal with this, especially given the strong resistance of some bishops, especially from the US, who are opposed to Pope Francis and the Synod? A similar, more provocative question, but which is why I want it asked. If Pope Francis died tomorrow, how significantly would progress around LGBTIQA people plus in the church be affected? In other words, how crucial is Pope Francis to potential change? And the last one I'll throw in there, hold on, lost it here. Yes, it's about the language. If the church were to remove phrases such as intrinsically evil or objectively disordered, what language would you suggest be the replacements?
Good. Okay, so the first question about the development of the Synod. I honestly don't know, because of course the Synod will be private, it'll be in purdah, as it were. We won't care about it. Apparently, in the 2014 Synod, there was a huge bust-up around this issue. Very vehement breakup from conservative people. And my sense is that one of the reasons why Francis chose this format with the build-up, the discussion, and so forth, is precisely because he's aware that this is not a change that can be made quickly, because those who are allergically frightened of it threaten schism on the grounds that this is the sacred quid of their life, fighting against gay people, which means fighting against themselves, but perhaps they don't realize that. Now, what he has done is that he has made available not only the bishops who've been chosen from the different places, but a wide spectrum of people from other backgrounds. So, as we know, for the first time, women and lay men voters who are both present and have the right to vote, as well as a variety of outside experts, which means that the discussion is going to be much more informed than it would be if it were only bishops talking amongst themselves, and bishops, all of whom are used to a certain sort of deferential omerta. I mean, I know some of the women who are going to be speaking in the Synod, and I can assure you that filters on their mouths are not something that I would expect. I mean, I've heard them speaking before, and ecclesiastical men are often running scared from them. So these are very powerful women, and they're not going to put up with nonsense. So that's the first thing. I think that the whole notion of people actually being able to discuss things honestly, it has as its perspective lowering the temperature on this issue, so that even the most frightened can cool it a bit. Now, remember the point about the United States. The United States we hear of because there is so much noise and so much virulent hatred from particularly very well-financed right-wing sources in the US. But actually, the bishops, I think it was 3 or 4 who are chosen by the US Conference of Bishops. Yep, they're not at all gay-friendly. But on the other hand, there are 4 US cardinals there who Francis appointed. There are several US lay people there, like Cynthia Bailey-Mann, a wonderful African-American leader of a parish, of the most progressive parish in Minneapolis. There's Jim Martin, etc., etc. Actually, there are more LGBT-friendly North American voices than there are hateful ones, and furthermore, voices that are well used to arguing with the others on their own terms. So I'm not frightened of that. Second, if Pope Francis died tomorrow, well, that's always true of every pope. One can't tell until whoever comes along instead comes along. I would say that, as I said before, I don't think that this genie can be put back in the bottle. It's become possible to talk about this. A number of very senior cardinals have made it quite clear that they think that the teaching is quite simply wrong, and a welcome discussion on what should be and how we should talk about these realities instead. They are not going to suddenly go back into the closet on this issue, simply because there's a new pope. I would have thought that attempts to close discussion down in the John Paul II way would simply not work at this point, and it would make the pope who attempted it would look foolish, rather as Paul VI unfortunately ended up looking foolish on Humanae Vitae. So I'm optimistic about the discussability, the talkability having developed, and not really being able to be shut up. Now, as to the third point, your third question, which I think is a very good question, and the answer is I am honestly not sure at all, because remember, the only sources from which the church has spoken on this issue in the past have been A, from its position on marriage, on the marital act, and B, from the so-called Clubber texts. And once you reckon that LGBT people just are that way, that you can't deduce who we are from the marital act, and at the same time you recognize that the traditional texts in this sphere apply to different ancient realities, but not to what we call homosexuality, then you realize that there is actually no particular source of teaching on this subject at all, which means that we have to work out for ourselves. And it's going to be the task, I think, of LGBT Christians ourselves to start to develop our understanding of what counts as appropriate flourishing, following otherwise common norms to Christianity. What does the life of the Spirit look like in the case of these particular people? What does flourishing look like? And I don't think that's going to happen quickly. I think that it will require this issue to be talkable about amongst ourselves and for some time. I mean, you're an historian. You're aware that these things don't develop. I think that we're in early days about this. For instance, my generation, I'm 63, my generation, we lived our adolescence much later than was appropriate for our age. Increasingly, we're finding gay kids who are starting to have their adolescences at the same time as their straight contemporaries, and adolescents in some countries who, ever since they've been conscious, of such matters, the possibility of their being married to someone of the same sex has been a possibility, which again, for many of people until very recently, this was simply not the case. Now, what is the shape of marital life going to look like for people who have undergone courtship, dating, etc., at the same time as and in the same way as their straight contemporaries? We get little hints with rather nice little films like Heartstopper and Sex Education and so forth. But the fact is that it's these people who are going to be saying, well, this is what works. This is what seems good or bad. This is what respecting, not respecting looks like. This is what loving or not loving looks like. So I think we're going to have to contribute to that. But I don't think there is an outside source of revelation on this matter. The moment you realize that the traditional source of revelation on this matter requires a negative deduction for something you're not, then we're in the sphere of we're going to have to work this out for ourselves, which is what you would expect in the life of the Spirit. The point is we are taken into spaces where we discover new things that we didn't know about, and we're going to have to work out what is good according to the best use of reason available to us at the time.
Thank you, James and Natalie and Noah, for your time. Now I'm going to hand this over to my colleague Benjamin O from the Rainbow Catholics InterAgency for Ministry.
Hello, everyone. I want to really thank James for that wonderful talk, and I'm sure your siblings, sisters, and brothers around Australia would join me in a delight for what you have helped illustrated and bring such clarity to. Thank you, Natalie, and also thanks Noah for facilitating that Q&A so wonderfully, actually, and Angela for starting out this conversation. I thought, so as a responder, I must tell you, I there is so many things I wanted to respond to because it was all very, very, very important. I think a big part of tonight really is, in my mind, we wouldn't have been able to have this conversation if we carry on talking about LGBTIQ people, about us without us. And that is an important thing that really, really echoed for me. Only when LGBTIQ people are speaking from a place of lived experience, from really just from our reality and from a truthful all of that reality, um, we can't begin to actually uncover the mystery and the flourishing of all of us, not just LGBTIQA plus people. Because the thing with cis hetero patriarchy harms all of us. Often people think it's just, it's the trans folk or the gay folk, but it's all of us. We are all harmed by it because we are all poorer without a wholer view of our whole humanity. So I want to thank James for that. I I thought about the synodality in what James was talking about, that Pope Francis have been speaking about, when James was speaking about relationship as the primary point of reference. And you hear the Holy Father talking about, ideology must come second. And ideology is not, we are about people, we're not about ideology. I think that's the crux of so much of what James have illustrated to us. One of the point that really jumped up to me was also about how often people who do not want this conversation to go on, their final straw is often, oh, this is going to cause a schism. The thing is, it's this, the genie is really out of the bottle. The only schism that is being asked for are not those, are those who actually wants the schism, if you like, I think. So I thought that's a very important point that really jumped out to me. The other thing that I think James spoke very, very simply to, and this is to all our trans, lesbian, bisexual, intersex, gay, queer, non-binary, LGBTIQA plus, Catholic siblings, sisters and brothers, your children, your cousins, your loved ones, to remind us that to appeal to our conscience, to ask them to always go to that very sacred place, that gem of a Catholic Christian teaching of the primacy of conscience, that we are a child of God. And to then go to that place, am I really what they say, that I'm a defective human person? Because that is obviously not true. And then to then ask the question, what is the flourishing? What does flourishing look like for me? I thought about, as we were talking about some of the think about connecting with the larger church, the way James so beautiful put in my mind Micah's Micah, the prophet Micah's quote to us, that we must be we must allow ourselves the generosity of learning as a church, as the people of God, all of us. And how the prophet Micah then says, God has told you what is good and what is required of you. Do what is right, love mercy, work humbly with your God, do justice, And I thought that is quite sometimes the opposite of sometimes the urge of control and power and some of those coercive control behavior. Like, for example, what James was alluding to about the legislative urge from hierarchy and power to appeal to law, like that document that was really, really damaging and harmful and then who promulgate this concept that is coined up by anti-trans people, gender ideology. No one uses really genuinely get what that means, because the only gender ideology is those who keep promoting this binary, really misogynistic view of, in my mind, a very old and unhelpful view of human sexuality and gender. The other point that I thought that was important was to talk about to do no harm. The bearers of the gospel, the bearers of Catholic teaching, and those of us who bear responsibility of care for one another, and in my mind, that's all of us, must go back to first principles, as what James was saying, do no harm. We have just gone through that searing process of the Royal Commission. And we are putting in place important things like safeguarding. And of course, one of the very key thing there was it identifies LGBTIQ people as one of the vulnerable population that has, lacked the safeguarding from our churches and from our institutions. So that I see how some of our leaders would, say that, we are holding to, second century ideas and whatever, and that's one thing. But to then actively not stop harm happening, when trans kids, trans youths, young people are still suiciding. Something has failed. Something is failing today in 2023 in Catholic institutions in our in Australia, and that must cause us to worry. This is not a matter of navel gazing and reflection. It's today. I think about, there are so many examples. Um, I and to this point, I wanted to connect to some of our allies and Catholic siblings who work with us, and LGBTIQ Catholics who are on this call. I hope you have received all this encouragement in asking you to be part of this important work that James and many of our siblings and colleagues are doing. That it's not an easy place, but it is also a place that is so important. And this is where the calling to non-LGBTIQ Catholic siblings, it's important. We need your support. We need your help to help us do this work. We need you to educate yourself. I'm thinking of all the resources that's out there in all kinds of languages. Think of this book. I think of books after books of so many siblings who have done all this work, and for many, many years. It really is incumbent on us all to do this work, but also for those of you who get this issue to help us speak out. When you see homophobia, when you see transphobia happening in institution and around you, when people make remarks, gently have those conversations and name them and say, that's not that's not what we are called to do. To name those abuse, to call it out, to correct that, but also to put resources where the work that we do are nothing about us without us. One of the important point that one of the points that I have reflected over the years, it's for LGBTIQ folks still are part of, in my mind, a domestically violent church environment. And that's not on. Where silencing, coercive control, editing out, I mean, these are all patterns of abuse. Surely we cannot allow this to carry on. I love the part where James that uses that phrase, don't give the bastards free rent space in your head. I think that is very, very important, especially to LGBTIQ folks. Find your flourishing, tell your story, live your fullest life, live out your faith. Be proud together with all of us of who you are. Don't let the obstacles get in the way of the object. And the other night, James was with us in a community gathering, by which someone quoted that resentment or anger, it's a bit pointless because resentment is a poison we drink but expects the others to suffer. A lot of what has happened in the past decades have been due to prophetic lives like LGBTI who dared to leave out your faith and be who you are, and to reach out to your conscience and shine and speak without reservation, to speak from a place of conscience. I'm gonna end my part, which is it's gonna be very odd for me to say this. I have faith in the people of God. If that is what you if that's one of the questions that people ask you, do you have faith in the church? My definition of it, I have faith in the people of God. Why? Because we are part of the people of God. There is hope all around me. So to this, I want to wrap up with this little sentence. And this is a paraphrasing a sentence of what Pope Francis said. That is often promulgated around. You pray for the hungry, then you feed them. That's how prayer works. So if I would paraphrase this for your LGBT siblings in our society, in our church, all around the world, you pray for LGBTIQ people, your siblings, then you stand with them for the injustice and make things better. So I ask of you all to continue to support all our ministry, the National InterAgency. It's supported by amazing other community organizations around the country, including Acceptance Perth, through the leadership of Angela and Tim and other people around the country. So please keep on working with us to make things better.
Thank you very much, Ben. It was very beautifully said. And I have to say, one of the beautiful things about working in this space is getting to see how God flourishes in every person's life. And I worked for the church and volunteered as well in youth and disability, and now this in acceptance. And it's beautiful to see how the people who, some of them, they have been hurt by the church, they're how resilient they are and still want to join in and be part of the church and part of God, and overcome all these boundaries. Yes, and now I'm going to hand it over to Eleanor, who is from the Australian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform and Women's Wisdom in the Church.
Thank you very much, Angela. And I just really want to say thank you very much to particularly James Alison, to Ben, to Angela, to Noah, and to Natalie for running a fabulous webinar. And I think James has left us with a very positive message. And Ben has done his very best to leave us with a positive message as well, which is that it's up to all of us to change the church and society, and that we do it one conversation at a time. And so thank you very much for being with us this evening. And we look forward to further webinars on all sorts of topics. But this one has been particularly useful and helpful. So thank you very much, James. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Natalie. And thank you, Angela. Good night.